new. During her research, she had discovered that several other property owners in the area had been paying HOA dues for years, even though their properties had never been formally incorporated into any recorded subdivision. The association had been collecting money from people who weren't legally bound by any covenant. The judge's expression changed when she heard this. She asked my attorney to elaborate. My attorney explained that the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association appeared to have been operating outside the bounds of proper legal authority. They had collected dues, enforced rules, and claimed ownership of property without any of the legal foundations that legitimate HOAs require. The HOA's attorney tried to object, but the judge cut him off. She said she wanted to hear more. When all the evidence had been presented, both attorneys gave their closing arguments. The HOA's lawyer tried to appeal to emotion one more time, talking about community and tradition and the unfairness of an outsider. Destroying what they'd built, my attorney kept it simple. She said the law was clear. You cannot build on someone else's land without permission. You cannot claim ownership based on a story with no documentation. And you cannot collect money from people under false pretenses. The judge didn't even leave to deliberate. She delivered her ruling right there. She said the evidence was overwhelming. The cabin had been built on my property without legal authority. The HOA had no easement, no deed, and no recorded agreement of any kind. I was within my rights to remove the structure. The HOA president shot to her feet. She shouted that this was outrageous, that I had destroyed community property and should be punished. The judge told her to sit down immediately. Her voice was ice cold. She continued her ruling. She said she was troubled by the evidence suggesting the HOA had been collecting dues without proper legal authority. She announced she was referring the matter to the state attorney general's office for investigation. The color drained from the HOA president's face. The judge looked at me. She said I was free to file a counterclaim for recovery of all dues paid under potentially fraudulent circumstances. Then she said 2 words. That ended it all. Case dismissed. I walked out of that courtroom feeling like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For months, I had been fighting a battle I never asked for. I had been threatened, intimidated, and dragged through a legal process designed to wear me down. And now it was over. But as it turned out, it wasn't really over. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. The judge's decision to refer the case to the state attorney general's office set off a chain of events that nobody saw coming. Within 2 weeks, investigators started looking into the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. What they found was worse than anyone expected. The HOA had never been properly incorporated. When you form a legitimate homeowners association, there are legal steps you have to follow. You file paperwork with the state. You record covenants with the county. You establish clear boundaries for which properties are included. None of that had been done. The Whispering Pines HOA existed only on paper that the board members had created themselves. The bylaws, the rules, the covenants they had been enforcing for 15 years were all legally meaningless. They had no authority to collect dues. They had no authority to approve or deny construction projects. They had no authority to do any of the things they had been doing, and yet they had been collecting $2,400 a year from property owners across the area. Some people had been paying for over a decade. When investigators added it all up, the total came to nearly $200,000 collected from 17 different households. $200,000 taken from people who didn't owe them a penny. The investigation also revealed where that money had gone. Some of it went to building and maintaining the cabin on my property. Some of it went to legal fees over the years when they threatened other property owners into compliance. But a significant portion of it had simply disappeared into accounts controlled by the board members. The HOA president was at the center of all of it. She was charged with fraud and theft by deception. The other board members faced lesser charges depending on their level of involvement. The legal process took several months, but eventually she accepted a plea deal. She pleaded no contest to the charges against her. The sentence was 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and full restitution to all affected property owners. She was also banned from serving on any homeowners association board in the state for the rest of her life. I heard later that she had to sell her own house to come up with the restitution money. The same woman who had shown up at my apartment threatening to make my life difficult was now the one facing consequences she never imagined. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel some satisfaction in that. My share of the restitution came to $38,000. That was the 15 years of dues my uncle had paid, plus interest. When that check arrived in the mail, I sat at my kitchen table and just stared at it for a while. It felt like justice, but it also felt like something more. It felt like my uncle was finally getting back what had been taken from him in the weeks after the court case. Something unexpected happened. Neighbors started reaching out to me. I got phone calls and emails from people I'd never met. Property owners in the area who had been paying dues to that fake HOA for years. They wanted to thank me. They said the HOA president had been terrorizing the community for as long as anyone could remember. She would show up at people's houses to complain about their landscaping. She would send threatening letters over minor issues. She would block construction permits and make life miserable for anyone who didn't follow her rules. People had been afraid to push back. They thought they were legally bound by the covenants. They thought they had no choice but to pay the dues and follow the rules. Nobody had ever challenged her, because she had convinced everyone that she held all the power until Jack came along. One man drove out to my property just to shake my hand. He told me he had been fighting with the HOA for years over a shed he wanted to build on his own land. The HOA president had blocked it every time. Now that the association was exposed as a fraud, he was finally free to build whatever he wanted. He said I had done what none of them had the courage to do. He said I had set them all free. I didn't know what to say to that. I told him I was just trying to use my own land. I never set out to be anyone's hero, but I understood what he meant. Sometimes it only takes one person to stand up before everyone else realizes they can too. The following spring, I finally started building my cabin. I hired a contractor, and we designed something simple but comfortable. 1,200 square feet, which was well over the 800 square foot limit the fake HOA had tried to impose. I didn't need anyone's permission. I didn't need anyone's approval. It was my land, and I could do whatever I wanted with it. The construction took about 4 months. I drove out every weekend to check on the progress and help where I could. Watching that cabin go up piece by piece was one of the most satisfying experiences of my life. When it was finished, I stood on the wraparound porch and looked out at the property that had caused me so much trouble. The hills rolling down toward the creek, the oak trees turning green with new leaves. The meadow that I had finally gotten cleared and planted with wildflowers, it was beautiful, and it was mine. On the day I finished setting up the furniture, one of my neighbors stopped by. He was an older guy who lived about a mile down the road. He brought a bottle of bourbon as a housewarming gift. We sat on the porch as the sun started to set, sipping whiskey and watching the light change over the Virginia hills. He told me more stories about the HOA president and the years of frustration she had caused. He told me about people who had moved away just to escape her. He told me about friendships that had been destroyed by petty disputes. She had escalated. He said the whole community felt different. Now, lighter, like a dark cloud had. Finally moved on, I poured us both another drink and leaned back in my chair. I told him I never wanted any of this. I just wanted a quiet place to get away from the city. I never expected to inherit land, never expected to find a cabin that didn't belong there, never expected to end up in court fighting a woman who thought she could take whatever she wanted. But I also told him I didn't regret any of it. Because sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy. Sometimes it costs you time and money and peace of mind. Sometimes people threaten you and try to make you back down. But if you know you're right, you have to stand your ground. You have to fight for what's yours. Because if you don't, people like that HOA president will just keep taking and taking until there's nothing left. The neighbor raised his glass. He said he was glad I was the one who inherited that land. He said my uncle would have been proud. I didn't know if that was true. I never really knew my uncle. But sitting there on that porch looking out at the land he left me, I liked to think he was somewhere smiling, The sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky orange and pink. The creek made soft sounds in the distance. The air smelled like pine and fresh grass. I had fought for this, and I had won. This was my land, my cabin, my peace, and nobody was ever going to take it from me again. Asterisk. Permission of the previous owner. I stated that I had given the HOA 30 days to remove it voluntarily, and they had refused. I said I was now exercising my legal right as the property owner to remove the unauthorized structure. The demolition crew got to work. It took most of the day. They started by disconnecting the generator and the propane tank safely. Then they removed the door and windows. The interior was exactly what I'd suspected from peeking through the curtains. Kayaks, camping gear, a full bar setup with expensive bottles of whiskey and vodka. There were framed photos on the walls showing smiling people at what looked like parties and gatherings. Comfortable furniture, a mini refrigerator. This wasn't community storage. This was a vacation retreat that the HOA had built for themselves. Using my family's land, the crew emptied everything from the cabin and set it aside. I had them document and photograph every item. I wasn't going to steal their belongings. I'd give them a chance to collect their stuff. But the structure itself was coming down. By early afternoon, the cabin was reduced to a pile of lumber and debris. The crew loaded everything onto trucks to be hauled away. I had them grade the area smooth and spread grass seed so the land would heal. By 6 o'clock, it was done. Where the cabin had stood that morning, there was now just bare earth waiting to grow over. No sign it had ever been there except for some disturbed soil. I stood there for a few minutes, just looking at the empty space. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction that I'd stood up for myself. Sadness that it had come to this. And underneath it all, simmering anger at the people who had put me in this position in the first place. My phone rang at 7:15. I looked at the screen and saw an unknown number. I answered anyway. It was the HOA president. I've heard people yell before. I don't think I've ever heard anyone scream the way she screamed at me that night. Her voice was so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She called me names I won't repeat. She said I had destroyed $40,000 worth of property. She said she was calling the police. She said I would go to prison for what I'd done. I waited until she paused to take a breath. Then I spoke calmly. I told her that cabin was on my land. I told her I had surveys, GPS coordinates, county records, and video documentation of the entire removal process. I told her that her organization had been trespassing on my property for over a decade, and that the only crime committed here was the one her HOA had been committing against my family. She started screaming again. She said I would pay for every nail, every board, every penny that cabin had cost. She said her lawyers would destroy me. She said I had no idea who I was dealing with. I told her I'd see her in court. Then I hung up. My hands were steady. My heart was calm. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I was in control. I called my attorney and told her what happened. She listened to the whole story, and when I finished, she actually laughed. She said the HOA president was going to have a very bad day in court. She said to make sure all my documentation was organized and ready to present. She said this was going to be the easiest case she'd handled in years. I drove home that night feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not just relief. Not just satisfaction. Justice. Real justice. And it was only just beginning. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I'd seen plenty of legal dramas on television. Big rooms with high ceilings and dramatic lighting. This was nothing like that. Just a modest room with fluorescent lights, wooden benches, and an American flag hanging behind the judge's chair, but the stakes were just as real as any movie. 3 months had passed. Since I demolished the cabin, 3 months of paperwork, depositions, and legal back and forth. The HOA had gone all in. They hired an aggressive attorney, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who seemed to enjoy the sound of his own voice. They filed motions accusing me of property destruction, vandalism, and causing emotional distress to their members. My attorney wasn't intimidated. She'd been preparing for this from the beginning, and she was ready. I arrived at the courthouse early that morning. I wore a simple suit and carried a thick binder of evidence that my attorney and I had put together. Every document we might need was in there, organized and tabbed. The survey, the county records, the deed history, photos and screenshots of the video documentation, copies of the demand letter and all correspondence. The HOA president was already there when I walked in. She was sitting in the front row behind the plaintiff's table, wearing a dark blazer and a pearl necklace like she was attending a business luncheon. She looked at me as I entered, and if looks could kill, I'd have dropped dead on the spot. I sat down next to my attorney and waited for the judge to arrive. The Honorable Judge. Odom entered the courtroom a few minutes later. She was a black woman in her 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She had a no-nonsense expression that told me she wasn't interested in drama or theatrics. She wanted facts. The HOA's attorney went first. He stood up and delivered an opening statement that was heavy on emotion and light on evidence. He talked about the cabin as if it were a historic landmark. He described the years of community gatherings, the memories created there, the bonds formed between neighbors. He painted me as an outsider who had swooped in and destroyed something, precious without any regard for the people it belonged to. Then he called the HOA president to the witness stand. She walked up there like she owned the room. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down with her back straight and her chin high. Her attorney led her through a series of questions, designed to make her look sympathetic. She talked about founding the Homeowners Association 15 years ago. She talked about my uncle, how he was one of the original members, how he supported the community from the beginning. She described the cabin as a shared resource that everyone contributed to and everyone enjoyed. Then she got to the heart of her argument. She claimed my uncle had given verbal permission for the cabin to be built on that spot. She said it was a gentleman's agreement, a handshake deal between neighbors who trusted each other. She said everyone in the community knew about it and accepted it as fact. By the time she finished, she had tears in her eyes. She dabbed at them with a tissue and looked at the judge like a victim seeking justice. Then it was my attorney's turn. She stood up slowly, holding a single sheet of paper. She walked toward the witness stand with a calm, measured pace. When she spoke, her voice was polite but firm. She asked the HOA president a simple question. Did she have any written documentation of this alleged agreement with my uncle? The woman hesitated. Then she said no, it was a verbal understanding. My attorney nodded. She asked if my uncle had ever signed a deed transferring any portion of his land to the HOA. No. Had the HOA ever recorded an easement with the county? No, but they didn't think they needed to. My attorney paused and let that answer hang in the air for a moment. Then she asked another question. If the agreement was so well known in the community, why was there no record of it in any HOA meeting minutes? No vote by the board? No mention in any official documents? The woman's composure started to slip. She said it was an informal arrangement. She said not everything needed to be written down. My attorney smiled slightly. She said that was interesting, because she had reviewed every document the HOA had produced during discovery. There was not a single reference to any land donation or agreement with my uncle. Not one. She held up the sheet of paper she'd been carrying. It was a copy of the HOA's original bylaws from 15 years ago. She read aloud from a section that stated all property acquisitions must be approved by a 2/3 vote of the membership and recorded with the county. She asked the HOA president if that vote ever took place. The woman didn't answer. Her attorney objected, saying the question had been asked and answered. The judge overruled him. The HOA president finally admitted that no formal vote had occurred. My attorney moved on. She asked about the cabin's contents, the kayaks, the camping equipment, the bar with expensive liquor, the comfortable furniture. She asked if this was really a community storage building, or if it was something else entirely. The woman tried to deflect. She said the items were for community use. She said members could check them out for personal trips. My attorney asked how often that happened. She asked for records of who had used the equipment, and when there were no records, she asked who had keys to the cabin. Only board members, She asked how many board members there were. 5. So, 5 people had access to a cabin filled with recreational equipment and a fully stocked bar, built on land they didn't own, and they called it a community resource. The HOA's attorney objected again. The judge told him to sit down. When my attorney finished her cross-examination, the HOA president looked shaken. The confidence she'd walked in with was gone. She returned to her seat without making eye contact with anyone. It was our turn to present evidence. My attorney was methodical and thorough. She introduced the county records showing unbroken ownership of the land from my uncle to me. She showed the survey confirming the cabin's location entirely within my property. She played clips from the video documentation of the demolition, including my statement explaining why the structure was being removed. She also introduced something: the sign on the door. I recorded video of myself walking the perimeter, narrating what I was seeing and giving the GPS coordinates. I wanted documentation that couldn't be disputed. Then I hiked back to my car and drove straight home that Monday. I started calling attorneys. I needed someone who specialized in real estate law, someone who understood property disputes and wouldn't be intimidated by a homeowners association with an attitude problem. The third lawyer I spoke with was exactly what I was looking for. She was a real estate attorney with about 20 years of experience. Sharp, direct, and clearly interested when I explained my situation. I drove to her office that Wednesday with all my documentation in hand. She spent about an hour going through everything: the county records, the HOA documents, the photos and videos I'd taken at the cabin, the deed history. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me with something close to disbelief. She asked me if I understood what I was looking at here. I said I thought so, but I wanted her opinion. She told me it was straightforward. The HOA had built a structure on my land without any legal right to do so. They had no easement, no deed, no recorded agreement of any kind. They had been trespassing on my property for what appeared to be over a decade, and they had been collecting dues from my uncle the entire time while using his land as their own. She said the word for that was fraud. I asked her what my options were. She laid them out for me. I could demand they remove the structure voluntarily. If they refused, I could take them to court. I could also pursue recovery of all the dues my uncle had paid over the years, since those payments were made under false pretenses. And depending on how things went, I might have a case for additional damages related to the unauthorized use of my land. I told her I wanted to start with a letter, give them a chance to do the right thing before we escalated. She agreed that was reasonable. She drafted a formal demand letter that week. The letter was polite, but firm. It stated that the cabin had been built on my property without authorization. It demanded that the HOA remove the structure within 30 days. It requested cessation of all trespassing on my land, and it demanded reimbursement of all HOA dues paid by my uncle over the past 15 years. Totaling $36,000, we sent it certified mail, signature required. 3 days later, I got a response. But it didn't come by mail. I was at my apartment on a Saturday morning when someone knocked on my door. I opened it to find the HOA president standing there with 2 men I didn't recognize. She introduced them as board members. I didn't invite them in. I stepped out into the hallway and asked what they wanted. The woman's face was tight with anger, but she was keeping her voice controlled. She told me I was making a serious mistake. She said my uncle had agreed to let them use that land. She called it a gentleman's agreement, an understanding between neighbors. I asked her if she had anything in writing. She hesitated. Then she said it wasn't that kind of arrangement. She said everyone in the community knew about it. She said my uncle had been a founding member of the association and had supported the cabin project from the beginning. I told her that was interesting, but it didn't change anything. My uncle never deeded that land to anyone. There was no easement on record. Whatever verbal agreement she thought existed, it had no legal standing. Her composure started to crack. She told me that cabin had been there for over 12 years. She said the community depended on it. She said I had no idea what I was starting. I kept my voice calm. I told her she had 30 days to remove the structure. I told her if it was still there on day 31, I would remove it myself. One of the men stepped forward. He was tall, heavy-set, with a red face that suggested he wasn't used to being challenged. He told me I'd be hearing from their attorney. He said the association had resources. He said they would make my life very difficult if I pursued this. I looked him in the eye and told him to do what he needed to do. Then I stepped back inside and closed the door. My hands were shaking a little. Not from fear, but from anger. These people had been stealing from my uncle for years. They'd built a private clubhouse on his land, charged him dues for the privilege, and now they were standing at my door making threats. I called my attorney that afternoon and told her what happened. She wasn't surprised. She said this was typical behavior for HOAs that had gotten used to operating without accountability. She told me to document everything and not to engage with them directly anymore. All communication would go through her office from now on. A week later, their attorney sent a letter. It was full of legal language and veiled threats. It accused me of attempting to interfere with established community property. It claimed the HOA had a valid interest in the land based on years of continuous use. It warned that any attempt to remove or damage the cabin would result in immediate legal action. My attorney read it and laughed. She said they were trying to scare me. She said their legal argument was paper thin. They couldn't claim adverse possession because they hadn't met the requirements under Virginia law. They couldn't claim an easement because none had ever been recorded. All they had was bluster. She told me to sit tight. She said if they wanted to take this to court, we'd be ready. But I was already thinking ahead. 30 days was almost up, and I had a feeling they weren't going to move that cabin on their own. If they wouldn't remove it, I would. The 30 days came and went. The cabin was still standing. I wasn't surprised. From the moment that woman showed up at my apartment with her board members, I knew they weren't going to back down easily. They'd been running this scam for years. They thought they could bully me into giving up. It's just like they'd probably bullied my uncle and everyone else in that area, but they didn't know me. And they were about to learn that I don't bluff. My attorney had been busy during those 30 days. She filed responses to their threatening letters. She gathered additional documentation from the county. She researched Virginia property law inside and out, looking for anything they might try to use against us. The HOA's next move was predictable. They filed for an emergency injunction to prevent me from touching the cabin. Their argument was that they had an established interest in the property based on years of use and community investment. They claimed removing the structure would cause irreparable harm to the association and its members. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. My attorney wasn't worried. She explained that under Virginia law, a property owner has the right to remove unauthorized structures from their land. The injunction request was based on the HOA, claiming they had some kind of easement, but they couldn't produce any documentation proving it. No signed agreement, no recorded deed, nothing. She told me their filing was a delay tactic. They were hoping the court process would drag on long enough that I'd get frustrated and give up. Or maybe they thought the legal fees would scare me off. They were wrong on both counts. I asked my attorney a direct question. Did I have the legal right to remove that cabin right now, before the hearing? She thought about it carefully. Then she said yes. The injunction hadn't been granted yet. It was just a request. And based on the evidence, she didn't think it would be granted at all. The HOA had no legal claim to my land, until a court told me otherwise. I was within my rights as the property owner to remove any unauthorized structure. She advised me to document everything thoroughly, get a fresh survey done, have witnesses present, make sure every step of the process was recorded so there could be no dispute about what happened or why. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing first. I hired a licensed surveyor to come out and formally mark the property boundaries. He confirmed what I already knew. The cabin sat entirely on my land, more than 200 feet from the nearest property line. There was no ambiguity. It was mine. Next, I found a licensed demolition contractor. I explained the situation honestly. I told him there was a legal dispute, but that I had documentation proving ownership. I showed him the survey, the county records, everything. He reviewed it all and agreed to take the job. I also hired a videographer. I wanted professional documentation of the entire process, not just shaky phone footage. I wanted timestamps, clear angles, an audio recording of everything that was said. The date was set for a Saturday morning in early October. I barely slept the night before. Not because I was nervous about what I was doing. I knew I was in the right. But I also knew there was going to be fallout. The HOA president wasn't going to take this quietly. I kept playing out scenarios in my head, trying to prepare for whatever might happen. I arrived at the property at 7 in the morning. The surveyor was already there, along with the demolition crew and the videographer. The air was cool and crisp. It's a kind of perfect fall morning that would normally make me happy to be outdoors. But I wasn't there to enjoy the scenery. We hiked into the property together. The demolition crew brought their equipment on a small utility vehicle that could handle the rough terrain. When we reached the cabin, I had the surveyor confirm on camera that we were standing on my property and that the structure was located entirely within my boundaries. Then the videographer recorded me making a statement. I explained who I was, that I had inherited this land, and that the structure in front of us had been built without my permission or the letter arrived on a Tuesday, and it changed everything. I was 34 years old. I was working as a civil engineer in the city, living a pretty ordinary life. I had a small apartment, a decent job, and not much else going on. My family wasn't close. My parents passed when I was in my 20s, and I didn't have siblings. The only relative I really knew about was my mother's brother, my Uncle Gerald, but I'd only met him twice in my entire life. Once at my mother's funeral, and once at a family gathering when I was maybe 10 years old. So when I got a letter from an attorney saying Uncle Gerald had passed away and left me something in his will, I honestly didn't know what to think. I figured maybe it was some old furniture or a few $1,000s. I wasn't expecting much, but it wasn't furniture. And it wasn't a small check. It was 12 acres of land in rural Virginia. I remember reading that letter 3 times because I couldn't believe it. 12 acres. My uncle had owned this property for over 30 years, and for some reason I'll never understand, he decided to leave it to me. The nephew he barely knew. The attorney handling the estate told me the property was about 2 hours from the city. It was undeveloped land, mostly wooded, with a creek running along one side. There was no house on it, no buildings that he knew of. Just land. I took the first weekend I could get off work and drove out there. The drive was beautiful. Once I got away from the city, the roads got narrower and the trees got thicker. I passed through a couple of small towns, the kind with one gas station and a church on every corner. Eventually, my GPS told me I'd arrived. I pulled off onto a dirt road that cut through the trees, and then I saw it. The property was more beautiful than I could have imagined. Rolling hills covered in oak and pine trees, a meadow in the middle that was overgrown but still gorgeous. And in the distance, I could hear water running. That had to be the creek the attorney mentioned. I parked my car and just walked around for a while, trying to take it all in. I couldn't believe this was mine. Right. All of it. 12 acres of peace and quiet, away from the noise of the city. I was already imagining what I could do with it. Maybe build a small cabin. Nothing fancy, just a place to escape on weekends. A place to fish in that creek and sit on a porch and watch the sunset. For about an hour, I was the happiest I'd been in years. And then she showed up. I was walking along what I figured was the western property line when I noticed someone standing near the road. A woman, maybe in her late 50s, with short gray hair and a stern expression. She was holding a clipboard and watching me like I was trespassing on her land instead of standing on my own. I walked over to introduce myself, figuring she was a neighbor. Maybe she wanted to welcome me to the area. I was wrong. She didn't smile, didn't offer her hand, just looked me up and down and said, "You must be Gerald's nephew." I said yes, I was. She nodded like she'd been expecting bad news. "I'm the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I manage this community." I remember being confused. I looked around at the trees, the empty land, the dirt road. This didn't look like any community I'd ever seen. There were no houses nearby, no subdivision, just woods and fields. I asked her what she meant by homeowners association. I told her this was rural property. There wasn't any neighborhood here. She smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile someone gives you when they think they know something you. She told me that my uncle had signed this property into the association 15 years ago. She said all the landowners in the area were part of it and that I'd be expected to follow the rules just like everyone else. Then she handed me a thick packet of papers. Must have been 50 pages at least. I asked what kind of rules she was talking about. She started listing them off like she'd memorized them. No structures over 800 square feet without board approval. No tree removal without permission. Restrictions on paint colors, if I ever built anything. Mandatory approval for any construction projects. An annual dues of $2,400. $2,400 a year? For land that didn't even have a house on it? I tried to stay calm. I told her I'd just inherited this property and I wasn't aware of any HOA involvement. I said I'd need to look into it before I agreed to anything. She didn't like that. Her expression hardened, and she told me the rules weren't optional. She said my uncle had agreed to them, and as his heir, I was bound by the same covenants. She said if I had any questions, I could bring them to the next board meeting. But until then, I shouldn't plan on doing anything with the property without approval. Then she turned and walked away. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't welcome me to the area. Just left me standing there holding that packet of papers. I sat in my car as the sun went down, reading through the documents by the light of my phone. Most of it was standard HOA nonsense. Rules about noise levels. Rules about parking. Rules about exterior appearances. The kind of stuff you'd expect in a suburban neighborhood. Not on 12 acres of forest, but then I found something that made me stop. There was a section about community common areas, according to the documents. The HOA maintained certain shared spaces for the benefit of all members. And one of those spaces was described as a community storage cabin. It's located on association common land. I pulled up the county GIS maps on my phone. These are public records that show property boundaries, ownership information, that kind of thing. I found my uncle's parcel, now my parcel, and looked at the boundaries. My stomach dropped. The area described as association common land. In the HOA documents wasn't some separate parcel. It wasn't land the HOA owned. According to the county records, it was right in the middle of my 12 acres. Dead center of my property. The HOA had apparently built a cabin on my land, and they'd been calling it their own for years. I sat there in my car for a long time, just staring at those maps. I kept checking and rechecking, thinking maybe I was reading it wrong, but I wasn't. The records were clear. That land had belonged to my uncle. It had never been deeded to any association. There was no easement, no transfer, nothing. They had just taken it. I drove home that night with my head spinning. I didn't know much about property law, but I knew enough to understand that you can't just build on someone else's land and claim it as your own. That's not how it works. But clearly, this woman thought differently. And from the way she'd talked to me, she was used to getting her way. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about that cabin I hadn't even seen yet, sitting somewhere on my property. I thought about that woman with her clipboard and her rules and her attitude. I thought about my uncle, who'd paid $2,400 a year. For 15 years to an association that had apparently been stealing his land the whole time, that was $36,000. $36,000 paid to people who had built on his property without permission by morning. I knew I wasn't going to let this go. I didn't care how much money this HOA had or how many rules they claimed to have. That was my land. And whatever they'd built on it, they were going to have to answer for it. I just didn't know yet how ugly things were about to get. The following weekend, I drove back to the property with one goal in mind. I needed to find that cabin. I'd spent the whole week researching. I pulled every document I could find from the county records office. I downloaded maps, property surveys, deed histories going back decades. Everything confirmed what I'd suspected. That land had belonged to my uncle since he bought it 32 years ago. He never sold any portion of it. He never gave anyone an easement. He never transferred a single acre to any homeowners association. Whatever cabin they'd built out there, I had no right to build it. I parked at the same spot as before and started hiking into the property. I had GPS coordinates from the county maps loaded on my phone, pointing me toward the center of the parcel where the so-called common area was supposed to be. The terrain was rough. Overgrown brush, fallen trees, muddy patches from recent rain. It took me nearly half an hour of pushing through the woods before I finally found it, and when I did, I stopped dead in my tracks. This was no storage shed. The structure in front of me was a proper cabin. Maybe 600 square feet, well-maintained, with a small porch on the front and a metal roof that looked fairly new. There were curtains in the windows, a welcome mat at the door, an electrical line running from a generator on the side of the building. I walked around the whole thing, taking pictures with my phone. On the back, there was a propane tank hooked up to what I assumed was a heating system. There were lawn chairs set up in a cleared area nearby, arranged around a fire pit with fresh ash in it. Someone had been here recently. The front door had a heavy padlock on it. Next to the door was a small wooden sign neatly painted that read WPHOA members only. I tried to look through the windows, but the curtains blocked most of my view. What I could see told me enough. This wasn't a place to store lawn equipment. I could make out shelves lined with what looked like camping gear. I saw the edge of a kayak leaning against one wall, and in the corner, unmistakably, was a small bar setup. Bottles on a shelf, glasses hanging from a rack. This was a clubhouse. A private retreat that the HOA had built for themselves on my property. I took photos of everything. The cabin from every angle, the generator, the propane tank, the fire pit.